by the time we come to the 1500s, because by 1440s, from our history of Africa and history of Western exploration, we already see that the Arab and the Muslims were already dominant in the Mediterranean. Arabic was the international language of the world at that time. Just like once upon a time Greek was, once upon a time Latin was, today English is. Now, at that particular moment in time, in the 1400s, just around the time when Prince Henry, who later got the sobriquet Navigator, started sending his mariners out of the southern port of Portugal called Lagos. Now, Prince Henry would assemble all the talents he could lay his hands on in Europe as well as in the Mediterranean region. It doesn't matter whether you're a Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. If you have the talent, we need you. And he was able to get all these groups to help him, just like the American administration of Eisenhower and Kennedy got all these fellows like Von Braun and all those scientists to help the space program. The same thing was done by him. So he was able to get all the brains he could get to help him create this naval academy in the southern tip of Portugal. Now, as a result of his success, he was able to send out mariners to go and explore the West African coastline. Because up until his decision to establish this naval academy and to send explorers, no one, to our knowledge, was able to sail south of Cape Bojado. We have the story of Hanno, the Carthaginian, who supposedly traveled south of Cape Bojado and explored some regions of Africa. We have that in some of the history books. But the evidence is not very convincing that he actually did that. But the account from Henry the Navigator, we know for sure, because we have ample evidence now that the Portuguese did travel south of Cape Bojado. The Portuguese were able to do it because they came up with new innovative vessels, the caravel. And the caravel, of course, would enable them to travel south of Cape Bojado. The point that you have to bear in mind really is that the movement of the winds. If your boat comes south of Cape Bojado, it was very difficult for the oarsmen to row their boat up. So the Portuguese were able to develop a technique of navigating these waters so that they would be able to sail south and then come back. And of course, this would set the stage for the later expeditions across the Atlantic. Because people like Columbus spent many years on the West African coast before they traveled to the Americas. Now, the point that we need to bear in mind here is that as a result of the gradual penetration of the West African coast by the Portuguese, the Muslims began to lose control. I see the time. The Muslims began to lose control over the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean was no longer the monopoly of the Muslims and the Arabs. And gradually, the European powers were able to explore this West African coastline. And of course, you know that Bartholomew Dias and Vasco da Gama would be the two Portuguese mariners who successfully circumnavigated the Cape of Good Hope towards East Africa and India. This will change world history. Just like the Sputnik of the Russians and the challenge it posed to America in terms of Apollo expedition, and then later the Eagle has landed. So I mean, the same kind of situation was happening in a different way, but similar. The Portuguese navigation of the African coastline to the Cape of Good Hope broke Muslim monopoly of world trade. Because now Europeans could bypass the Muslim strongholds in the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. They could now go all the way to the Indian Ocean and compete for access to the spices of Asia. This changed world history. That's how world history changed over the last 400 years. And the balance of power shifted from the Mediterranean people. Because the Mediterranean people, whether they were Jews, Persians, Chaldeans, Babylonians, Sumerians, they dominated the world. But power now shifts to the European people. And the last Mediterranean people, to Hegel, as Hegel would say, the universal spirit takes a westerly direction. So, I mean, you know, like that, so the universal spirit was moving. The people of the East were dominant, but then gradually it was moving towards the Western people. And of course, the last 500 years proved that, to the point that the last Mediterranean people who were dominant, after taking power from the Jews, the Greeks, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and others, were the Portuguese and the Spaniards. And today they are the bottom in the European pyramid. 500 years. Power shift. You see what I'm saying? Go ahead.
I wanted just to clarify, the name of that vessel was a caravel?
Yeah, the caravel. Caravelle.
V-E-L-L-E.
Yeah, caravel. That was a revolution, just like this, you know, now we have, the Americans are leading the world today, so they are inventing new things, and computers and other things. Yeah, that's what happened in history, yeah.
Who were the years for the Sufi orders?
The the Sufi orders came to Africa here in the 17th century. What you would call 1600s. From that time on, they were already, exposed. They came into Spain before the collapse of the Muslims in Spain, but they did not move south until later. They came to sub-Saharan Africa in the 16th, 17th century. So by the 17th century, the Sufi orders were already in North Africa.
So by the time the Portuguese were whittling away at the Islamic ports on the African coastline, the Sufis were
already there.
Adherents.
That's right. The Sufis were already established in North Africa, and they were gradually now penetrating sub-Saharan Africa. But they will become more visible, and this coincided with the European presence already. By the 18th century, just around the time of the War of Independence, the Sufi groups were already established, and they were now beginning to take over some of these centers of power. Time, she is giving the signal. So, but we will have another hour or so to do.
That's the Grim Reaper.